Have you ever wondered how one of history's greatest figures, Napoleon Bonaparte, began his journey to the pinnacle of power? Do victories and defeats, bold decisions truly create a legend? Join me as we uncover the secrets behind the coup of 18 Brumaire and the surprising steps of this remarkable emperor. The article below has been compiled from many sources. If there are any mistakes or if you know any interesting information, feel free to leave a comment so I can learn as well. Now, let's begin the article. Coup of 18 Brumaire, 9th November 1799. Paris, November. The sky was low and gray like the scheming thoughts that hung heavy over the city. The air was thick with unease. In the long corridors of the Luxembourg Palace, lawmakers talked much and acted little, while outside the people quietly followed the rumors. One name gradually resurfacing on their lips: Bonaparte. Napoleon was not in a rush. Since his return to French soil, he had remained strangely silent, as if listening to the heartbeat of a crumbling power structure. The consular government seemed to have lost control of the situation, and in that moment an opportunity arose. A group of politicians, Talleyrand, Sieyès, Fouché, each with their own agenda but united by one common point. They needed a steady hand, decisive enough to strangle the chaos. And Napoleon, with eyes sharp as steel and a voice that never trembled, seemed to be the choice, an inevitable one. On the morning of 18 Brumaire, under the guise of protecting the nation, Napoleon marched his troops into Versailles, where the council had temporarily relocated. He entered the meeting room amid shouts from the delegates, attempting to calm them, but his words quickly became meaningless amidst the uproar. Opponents were dragged out of the room. Those who hesitated fell silent. By the end of the day, the majority had been convinced. There were no gunshots, no blood was shed, but power had changed hands. The next day, France awoke to a new reality. Power no longer rested in the hands of the elected representatives, but in the hands of a group of 3 consuls, of which Bonaparte, though just one name among the 3, was the one all eyes were upon. Was this the step to save France, or merely the first move in a game of power that would stretch across decades? As night fell over Paris that evening, perhaps even Napoleon himself could not yet answer. Consolidating power and reforms under the Consulate. Paris entered the new century under a form of rule unlike any before. Beneath the title of the consular government, a republican system on paper, real power had quietly consolidated in the hands of one man. While on paper, Napoleon was merely the first consul alongside his colleagues Moreau and Lebrun. The political heartbeat of France seemed to follow the rhythm of his pulse. In the initial months, Napoleon did not wield power through force, but through speed. The speed of reforms, laws, and constitutions being drafted almost without rest. He re-established order where the fever of revolution had once distorted it, from a financial system in chaos to a disjointed legal framework and an overburdened administrative apparatus. The lazy officials were purged, the incompetent replaced. Those with ability, whether old aristocrats or radical Jacobins, if useful, found a place in the new order. Not all the French people understood fully what was happening, but they felt the change. Bread was no longer as scarce as before. Currency began to stabilize. The lawlessness in the streets receded. In the reopened classrooms, children again carried books to school, under a national education system built almost from scratch. In the shadows, not everyone was content. The royalists whispered, the extreme republicans quietly regrouped. But Napoleon was never complacent. His intelligence network expanded, and conspiracies were nipped in the bud. He didn't need the public executions of the old revolution, yet every move he made left its reverberations. Under the hand of this first consul, France seemed to be stabilizing. But was this truly a moment of peace, or just a step backward, gathering momentum for an empire that was about to be born? Napoleon becomes emperor. The coronation that shook Europe. Paris in the winter of 1804 bore a cold exterior, but beneath that ice, the heart of France seemed to be simmering with a different kind of heat. The heat of anticipation, doubt, and desire. After years of consolidating power as first consul, Napoleon began to take a new turn. Rumors began to swirl through the political salons, from the houses on Montmartre to the corridors of the Tuileries, that the young first consul had ambitions to crown himself. Some welcomed the idea, others recoiled. Not all had forgotten Louis XVI, and the guillotine still lingered like a dry stain on the pages of history. Yet, on December 2, 1804, the solemn ceremony took place in Notre-Dame Cathedral, amidst the flickering candlelight and the heavy scent of incense. Pope Pius VII, having crossed the Alps to reach Paris, sat on his throne in the palace, not with the haughty air of a benefactor, but as a witness to a world in transformation. When the crown was placed in the hands of the Pope, the air held its breath, but then Napoleon stepped forward, deliberate, unhurried, and with his own hands, lifted the crown and placed it on his own head. In that moment, many would say that the world seemed to stop for a beat. Not out of surprise, but because they did not know what they were witnessing. An insult, a declaration, or a new reality being accepted. Josephine, the wife who had once captivated him so much that he wrote dozens of love letters, was also anointed and crowned. The two stood there, amidst the sacred chants, the gaze of the great nobles, the generals, and many of those who had once doubted him. In that moment, a Corsican artillery officer, the son of a provincial lawyer, had risen to the highest peak a Frenchman could reach, not by bloodline, but by determination and circumstance. Outside France, other thrones began to tremble. European monarchs sat in their courts, flipping through reports, trying to understand what was happening in the mind of the man who had crowned himself. Perhaps for them, the ceremony was not just a ritual, but a warning. But for the French, that coronation was likely the opening of a new chapter, one of victories, ambitions that stretched beyond borders, and consequences no one could yet predict. The war with the Third Coalition, the thunder from Austria, the echo from Austerlitz. Europe was once again shifting, but this time it wasn't merely about conspiracies behind closed doors or cold treaties. The fear of Napoleon, once a young general, then a consul, and now an emperor, had solidified into a tangible dread within the courts of Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg. In 1805, under the leadership of the young British Prime Minister William Pitt, a new alliance was formed, the Third Coalition, gathering the most powerful forces on the continent: Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. Their goal was not just to halt Napoleon, but perhaps to erase him entirely from the chessboard of power. Napoleon, never one to wait to be surrounded, struck first. Under the guise of protecting France, he launched a lightning campaign. The Grand Army, the Great Army, was formed, an army of unparalleled discipline and prowess, with experienced officers like Davout, Ney, Lannes, Soult, and Murat at its helm. Napoleon's army crossed the Rhine, a sharp thrust into the heart of Germany. While the Austrian generals were preoccupied with organizing defenses, he swiftly besieged the city of Ulm, forcing the entire Austrian army under General Mack to surrender. Nearly 30,000 soldiers taken without a major battle. The news struck like thunder in the Habsburg court, but the victory at Ulm was not the pinnacle. All eyes and history would turn to a small field near the village of Austerlitz, where, on December 2, 1805, the fog would lift to reveal one of the greatest battles in European history. Three mighty armies, France, Austria, and Russia, stood facing each other in the cold mist. Initially, the balance of forces seemed to favor the Allies, but those who understood Napoleon knew, when he chose the battlefield, the enemy rarely retained the upper hand. Napoleon stood on the Zerlin Hill, watching the Russian and Austrian forces descend the slopes, as if walking into a trap. When the enemy's center withdrew from the high ground, he ordered a counterattack like a bolt of lightning. The French units, hidden in the fog, suddenly surged forward like a beast unleashed, slicing through the enemy lines and splitting them in two. By the evening, the sun over Austerlitz pierced the mist, illuminating the scattered bodies of the fallen enemies on the ice and snow. The French soldiers called it Napoleon's sun, a light that appeared precisely when he needed it most. The once boisterous Third Coalition collapsed in a single battle. Russia withdrew in silence. Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg, conceding territory and honor. Europe, once again, had to redefine its order, with Napoleon at the center of the map, an undeniable force. The war with the Fourth Coalition. The steel storm on Prussian soil. Not long after the defeat of the Third Coalition, Prussia, which had stayed out of the conflict, began to shift its stance. Some nobles in Berlin could no longer stand by while Napoleon reshaped the map of Europe without their input. The Prussian army, though not battle-tested for years, still carried the glorious memory of Frederick the Great. Many believed that if any nation had the strength to stop the Corsican, it was them. In 1806, King Frederick William III, previously quiet and indecisive, finally declared war on France. It was a decision born out of fear of being left out of Europe's new order, and pressure from his court. But they likely didn't realize the opponent they were challenging was no longer just a general but Napoleon, the emperor of modern warfare. Napoleon did not wait for Prussia to attack. He deployed the Grand Army, once again conducting lightning-fast marches, splitting his forces into several wings, piercing through the enemy's defenses like spears. On October 14, 1806, two battles erupted almost simultaneously, Jena and Auerstedt. At Jena, Napoleon personally led his forces, obliterating the main Prussian army. Thinking he had secured a complete victory, he was unaware that nearby, Marshal Davout, with only a third of his forces, had decisively defeated a Prussian army twice his size at Auerstedt. Those two swift victories caused Prussia, once a military powerhouse of Europe, to collapse like a crumbling fortress. In less than a month, the French army entered Berlin. Napoleon rode through the Brandenburg Gate, the symbol of Prussian pride, as a victorious lord, but without a single word of mockery. In Berlin, he issued the Continental System, a grand effort to strangle Britain's economy by blockading goods from the British Isles from reaching mainland Europe. But this was a risky gamble, as it left many neutral nations, and even allies, disgruntled. However, the victory in Prussia did not mark the end of the conflict. In the east, Russia was gathering its army, determined to avenge its defeat at Austerlitz. Tsar Alexander I's hand was reaching out, and Napoleon knew, to hold on to what he had just gained, he would have to march again into the white snow of the north. The Polish Campaign, a life-or-death struggle on snow and ice. At the end of 1806, as the French flag flew over Berlin, Napoleon did not return to Paris. He knew well that Tsar Alexander I's shadow was looming in the east, and the Russian armies were advancing toward the swampy, freezing land of Poland. There was no time to hesitate. He urged his army forward, crossing the Oder River, pushing deep into the land once divided among empires. The bitter cold, the muddy roads, the desolate forests. Everything seemed determined to swallow up the once unbeatable army. The days of marching became a battle, not with the Russians, but with hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Yet Napoleon pressed on, like a wolf hunting its prey in the snowy wilderness. On February 7, 1807, in the small village of Eylau, the two largest armies in Europe clashed in one of the bloodiest and most chaotic battles of the age. The thick fog, the biting cold winds, the white snow stained with red blood. It was not a battle of grandeur like Austerlitz, but a nightmare. The regiments fought with rifle butts, bayonets, and bare hands in the muddy, snow-covered ground. Casualties were heavy, and neither side achieved a clear victory. Some say that after Eylau, Napoleon was no longer seen as the invincible god by his own soldiers. But just a few months later, everything changed. Napoleon did not retreat. He reorganized his army and gathered all his strength for a decisive counterattack. And on June 14, 1807, exactly 2 years after Austerlitz, the French met the Russians once again at Friedland, on the banks of the Alais River. This time, there was no fog or snow. On an open field, the Russian forces were slowly pushed back toward the river behind them. Napoleon saw the decisive moment. He ordered a full-scale assault. The artillery shattered the defensive lines, and the cavalry surged forward like a storm. The retreat route was cut off, and the Russian forces crumbled. Friedland was not just a military victory, it was the bell tolling for a new order. The Treaty of Tilsit, when two emperors meet. A few weeks later, in early July 1807, a strange meeting took place on the Niemen River, on a floating platform constructed in the middle of the water, neutral, belonging to no one. On that platform, two individuals representing the two most powerful empires in Europe gazed at each other for the first time. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, and Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia, one with eyes as hard as steel, the other soft-spoken and mysterious. They were not friends, nor were they outright enemies. They were like two mountains, each trying to avoid an earthquake. They spoke for hours. It is rumored that Alexander, captivated by Napoleon's intellect and personality, said, "If I were French, I would follow you." To which Napoleon replied, "If I were Russian, I would serve under you." The result was the Treaty of Tilsit, a division of Europe into two spheres of influence. Russia agreed to close its ports to British goods. Prussia, the defeated power, lost half its territory. A new empire was born from Napoleon's ambitions, the Duchy of Warsaw, reviving the name of a Poland that had once been partitioned. This was the peak of Napoleon's power. From Spain to the Niemen River, from Rome to Hamburg, his influence spread. But it was here, at Tilsit, under the calm faces and handshakes, that perhaps the seed of betrayal was first sown. Not between nations, but within the hearts of men, where ambition and fear could not be controlled. The Peninsular War, the Quagmire of Spain. In 1808, at the height of his power, Napoleon decided to intervene in the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain, an ally of France, was weakening and in chaos. Initially, he sought only to resolve the internal conflict in the Spanish court, embroiled in a feud between King Carlos IV and his son, Prince Ferdinand. However, things soon spiraled beyond his control. In a bold, or perhaps reckless move, Napoleon installed his brother Joseph as the King of Spain, replacing the Bourbon dynasty. The throne was built on foreign power, igniting the fury of the Spanish people. Unlike his previous swift campaigns, this time the French army was faced with an intangible enemy. guerrilla resistance. From the Sierra Mountains to the narrow streets of Madrid, civilians, farmers, priests, merchants, even women and children became fighters. By day they submitted. By night, they killed French soldiers in dark alleys. The regular French armies, accustomed to large battles, now trudged through a maze of hatred and rebellion. The uprising in Madrid on May 2nd, 1808, a desperate battle, became a symbol. Civilians, armed only with their bare hands, fought against French soldiers with guns. The next morning, they were executed in mass. But from that spilled blood, the flames of resistance spread across the entire peninsula. Napoleon, frustrated and unwilling to let this quagmire drag on, personally led his grand army over the Pyrenees. Within a short time, he recaptured Madrid and defeated many Spanish forces. But as soon as he left, the fire reignited. Spain refused to submit. Then a new factor emerged: Britain. British forces, led by General Arthur Wellesley, later to be known as the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and began expanding their influence. Not only did they bring troops, but they also supported the local resistance movements. In the years that followed, Spain became a festering wound for the French Empire. Each month, each year, France had to send more soldiers, supplies, and money. But the more they sent, the deeper they sank. Spain, no longer because of its army's strength, but because it refused to surrender, became the quagmire that trapped Napoleon. A war without a formal declaration, no clear front lines, but one that slowly drained the blood from an empire. The marriage to Marie-Louise, Napoleon's quest for an heir. After more than a decade of relentless warfare, Napoleon, now Emperor of France, possessed everything a man could dream of. Lands stretching across Europe, kings kneeling before him, and millions of soldiers at his command. But despite his golden throne forged by military victories, one crucial element was missing: an heir. With Josephine de Beauharnais, his first wife, he had love, companionship, and a turbulent past. Yet, Josephine could not bear him a child. The quiet years of waiting in the Tuileries Palace passed, until one day, Napoleon seemingly had no choice but to make a heartbreaking decision: divorce. The divorce, though not filled with hatred, left a difficult-to-fill void. Josephine departed, retaining the Malmaison Palace, while Napoleon, the man who had once promised to love her forever, now sought a marriage not based on love, but on the scales of power. His chosen partner was none other than the Habsburg royal family, a dynasty that had once been his archenemy. The chosen one was Marie-Louise, the Princess of Austria, granddaughter of Marie Antoinette, the former Queen of France, who had been executed during the Revolution. Marie-Louise, only 18 at the time, had never met Napoleon. But the marriage was arranged as if on a chessboard. A monarch who sought not only to befriend the French aristocracy, but also to form a blood alliance with the royal houses of Europe. A young Austrian princess taught that national duty always came before personal feelings. They married in 1810. The wedding was grandly celebrated in Paris, amidst fireworks and flowers. Marie-Louise entered the palace not with love, but with fear. Fear of her husband, 20 years her senior, who was famous for his temper and had shaken all of Europe. But their marriage, at least in its early years, wasn't as cold as many expected. Marie-Louise, shy and gentle, seemed to slowly accept her fate. Just a year later, she gave Napoleon a son, Napoleon François Joseph Charles Bonaparte, who was crowned King of Rome. The entire nation of France erupted in joy. In Napoleon's eyes at that moment, there was perhaps no greater joy. He cradled the child in his arms, his heir, the symbol of the empire's immortality. The dream of a Bonaparte dynasty seemed to have begun to take shape, but time would not allow that dream to last long. Outside the golden walls of the Tuileries Palace, Europe was silently regrouping. The cracks in the old alliances slowly closed, and after a brief period of glory, a slippery path awaited Napoleon ahead, stretching all the way to the frozen expanse of Moscow. The Russian Campaign, 1812, marching into death. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon led one of the largest armies ever assembled in Europe. About 600,000 men from across his client states, marching eastward. It wasn't just a military campaign, it was a colossal gamble. For the Emperor of France seemed to have realized that unless Tsar Alexander I was forced to submit, his empire would never truly be stable. The war began not with the roar of gunfire, but with silence. The Russian forces did not engage. They retreated deep into the interior, burning villages, destroying supplies, transforming their land into a vast desert. Fields of golden wheat became seas of black ash. Napoleon's mighty army advanced without food or provisions. In the oppressive summer heat, soldiers began to collapse from exhaustion, one after another. Disease crept in, and desertions skyrocketed. When they finally reached Moscow, the heart of Russia, the city had been abandoned, left to burn. Napoleon entered Moscow in silence. No one welcomed him. No one came to negotiate. There were no demands of surrender, only ashes and thick smoke. He stayed in the deserted city for over a month, waiting for a word from the Tsar, but it never came. Then, winter struck. There was no preparation, no supplies, no way back. Napoleon's army began to die, step by step. As they retreated, they were pursued by Russian forces. Heavy snowstorms fell. Frozen hands could no longer hold their rifles. Cannon carts were abandoned, buried beneath the ice. It is said that on some nights, the sounds of men groaning from the cold drowned out the howling winds. And by dawn, when the sun rose over the gray horizon, only a few survivors remained. When the army reached the Berezina River, one of the final stages of the retreat, the bodies of men and horses piled up under the cold waters. The temporary wooden bridges were burned by the Russian forces in the middle of the river. From above, Napoleon seemed to witness the nightmare unravel in his eyes. By the time the remnants of his army returned to France at the end of the year, less than 50,000 men remained. The soldiers who once cheered across the Central European plains were now mere ghosts, covered in the white snow. And from that moment on, the empire began to crack. The Battle of Leipzig, 1813, when all of Europe rose up. After the catastrophe in Russia, Napoleon was no longer the invincible figure he once was. Though still a military genius, cracks began to form throughout his empire. The countries that had once been subdued, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Russia, now came together in a new alliance. No longer was anyone standing alone against France. Together, for the first time, they set out to hunt a wounded lion. In the autumn of 1813, in the city of Leipzig, located in Saxony, over 600,000 soldiers from across Europe gathered in what was an unprecedented gathering in history. Napoleon had about 200,000 troops, the majority of whom were green recruits, never before having stepped onto a battlefield. Facing them were the armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, the very same powers who had previously failed, now returning to demand blood. The battle lasted for 3 days, October 16th to 19th, 1813. In the beginning, Napoleon held his ground, maneuvering as skillfully as he had for years. But with each passing hour, the enemy forces were continuously reinforced, while he could not retreat. The city of Leipzig became a massive slaughterhouse. Every street, every bridge, every surrounding field turned into a battlefield. The cannons roared relentlessly. The sound of horns, the screams, the neighing of horses, all mixed with the smell of smoke, blood, and mud. By the third day, the Allied forces had surrounded Napoleon on 3 sides. He ordered a retreat, but the bridge across the Elster River, the only escape route, was blown up too early, while much of the French army was still on the other side. Thousands of soldiers were left behind, unable to escape. They drowned, were captured, or were trapped in the flames. The units that had followed Napoleon from Egypt to Austerlitz, from Spain to Poland, were now torn apart in a foreign city. Napoleon managed to escape, but his once feared reputation no longer struck terror across Europe. On a cold autumn day in Leipzig, his dream of European dominance began to unravel. Exile at Elba, an emperor without a throne. After the defeat at Leipzig and the fall of Paris in March 1814, Napoleon had no other choice but to abdicate. On April 6th of that year, in a quiet room at Fontainebleau, he signed a document that would cast him down from the heights of power. No longer with a mighty army, no longer hearing the victorious cheers of his troops, he was left with nothing but the reality of his own downfall. The European powers, perhaps still holding some respect for the man who had once made them tremble, did not send him to the guillotine. Instead, they granted him a small kingdom, the island of Elba, located in the Tyrrhenian Sea, a tiny, desolate land with only a few thousand inhabitants and rocky hills. And so, an emperor who had once commanded the world's greatest army became the ruler of a handful of villages and olive groves. On the day he left France, Napoleon wore his old cloak, walking slowly between the rows of soldiers standing at attention. Some bowed their heads in silence, a few cried. Others gripped their swords tightly. He spoke little, only stopping to glance back one last time at the north, where Paris still lay shrouded in mist, before stepping into the carriage. At Elba, Napoleon did not sit idle. He reorganized the administration, improved roads, built a hospital, and even established a police force for the tiny island, treating it as though it were a new empire. But how could a man who once held all of Europe in his grasp be content with just a few square miles of rocky land surrounded by sea? He began to hear news from France. The Bourbons had returned to the throne. The people were dissatisfied, and former officers were being cast aside. Meanwhile, ships from France continued to bring him scraps of information. Paris still remembers you. The army has not forgotten. Every night, from his small balcony, he gazed out at the lights on the mainland, faint but undying. And deep in his heart, perhaps he never stopped thinking about the day he would return. The 100 Days, the final flame of an empire. In February 1815, as the cold winds still swept through the stone alleys of Elba, a small fleet quietly set sail from the island. On board, there was no treasure, no massive army, only a man in a gray cloak, his eyes fixed on the northwest horizon. It was Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once conquered all of Europe, now returning to France with only a few hundred loyal soldiers. Without firing a single shot, without drawing a sword, he landed on the coast of Golfe-Juan and began his lightning-fast journey across the Alps toward Paris. Along the way, soldiers who had once fought under the tricolor flag saw him and hesitated. But then, as he stepped forward, opened his coat, raised his hand and said, "If you want to kill your emperor, here I am before you." Instead of the sound of guns firing, the only sound that echoed was the cry, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the emperor!" Like an unstoppable flood, he advanced toward Paris. King Louis XVIII fled. In less than a month, Napoleon was back in the Tuileries, and thus began the 100 Days, a brief but fervent period when he once again reclaimed the throne, amid storm and fleeting hope. However, Europe had not forgotten. The great powers, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain, would not give him a second chance. They quickly reformed the alliance, sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers toward France. Napoleon knew there was no other option but war. He chose to strike first, hoping to divide and destroy each army before they could unite. His campaign led him to a small patch of land in Belgium, a place called Waterloo. Waterloo, the bell that ended a legend. On the morning of June 18, 1815, gray clouds lingered over the marshy fields of Waterloo. The rain had just stopped, the ground soaked, and cannons struggled to move. Soldiers, clad in gray, green, and red, stood still in the early mist. Everything seemed to be waiting for something, a beginning or an end. Napoleon, standing before the map stretched out on the command table, knew that time was not on his side. The Prussians were approaching from the east, under the command of General Blücher. In front of him was a mixed Anglo-Dutch force led by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, an opponent not to be underestimated. The first French cannons roared, shaking the stillness of the field. The battle had begun. For hours, cavalry, infantry, and artillery clashed across the battlefield. Names like Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Papelotte became synonymous with bloodshed. The French forces repeatedly seemed on the verge of breaking the Allied lines, but Wellington held firm, stubbornly defending his positions. By afternoon, the sky remained overcast. Then, the bad news came. Blücher had arrived, bringing the Prussian army advancing from the right flank. Napoleon was forced to throw in his final line of defense, the Imperial Guard, which had long been regarded as invincible. They advanced in dense formation, their steps disciplined as if marching in review. But when subjected to heavy artillery fire and met with a wall of enemy gunfire, their ranks began to falter. When the Imperial Guard broke, a wave of despair swept across the French army. By dusk, the fields of Waterloo became a graveyard for tens of thousands of souls. French soldiers fled in chaos, flags were buried in the mud, and Napoleon left the battlefield in silence, carrying the weight of his final defeat. The throne that once lifted him to the heights of Europe did not await his return. Paris was colder than before. The Allies entered, forcing him to abdicate for the second time. No longer to be exiled to Elba, this time it was the remote island of St. Helena, far in the Atlantic Ocean, where storms and isolation awaited. And on that island, an empire closed, not with the sound of triumphant horns, but with the quiet breath of a man who had once changed the course of history. Exile on St. Helena, a death and a legacy that never fades. The vast ocean. A lonely island adrift in the heart of the South Atlantic. St. Helena, a name that echoes with the sound of forgotten things, became the final destination for Napoleon Bonaparte after his defeat at Waterloo. No fanfare, no parades, no royal halo. Only a ship silently cutting through the waves, carrying the man who once shook all of Europe. St. Helena offered nothing to hold on to. The winds never ceased. Rain and mist cloaked the rocky hills. Longwood House, damp, desolate, became the final home of the man who once ruled the largest empire in modern Europe. The walls were moldy, the old desk worn, and the letters sent to Paris went unanswered. Everything felt like a prison, dressed in the cloak of freedom. Napoleon no longer wore his tricorn hat, nor his coat adorned with medals. He often wore a simple white shirt, walking alone in the small garden, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where France lay hidden behind 1,000 miles of ocean. He read books, wrote memoirs, debated politics with a few close officers, and especially reminisced. Austerlitz, Egypt, Josephine, Paris, the thunderous applause at Notre-Dame during his coronation, all fragmented pieces of glass sparkling in his memory. Illness quietly gnawed at his body, his stomach ached, and his breath was labored. Some days he couldn't leave his bed. In May of 1821, beneath the gray skies of St. Helena, Napoleon took his final breath. It is said that on his lips was but one whisper: France. He was buried beneath the rocky earth of the island, without a throne, without insignia, just a simple stone. The inscription on his tomb didn't even specify his name, because France and Britain could not agree on whether to call him emperor or general. Years later, Napoleon's ashes were brought back to France, resting beneath the dome of Les Invalides. A silent crowd followed the funeral procession, no longer for power, but for something deeper. Perhaps it was a chapter in history that had once made the whole world hold its breath. Whether loved or hated, admired or despised, it is hard to deny, the name Napoleon cannot be forgotten. Not because he was an emperor, but because he was a storm, one that swept through an era, leaving deep scars in the history of Europe. Thank you all for following and listening. If you enjoyed and found it interesting, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for our upcoming videos.